Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll take a look at the Red Army's second, and this time successful, offensive into East Prussia in 1945. It's a campaign that saw a bitter months-long siege and resulted in the disappearance of a historic German region. Hi Jesse, here we are. Another week, another podcast. So East Prussia, round two. So last week we looked at some of the historical links from East Prussia to remaining Germany, you might say. We looked at the opening stages of the battle in and for East Prussia, which in particular was the October 1944 offensive. We looked at a famous and infamous action, so the killing of the German civilians at Nemmersdorf, so this atrocity. So I think we set the scene for the second stage of this particular, let's call it a campaign. And as I said in the opening sentence, a campaign that eventually leads to the disappearance of an entire historic and important German region or province or whatever you want to call it. So where do we start this? Is sad the right word? I'm not quite sure. Sad story or whatever the right word is for this. Mm-hmm.
I guess, as usual in wartime, what's sad sometimes depends on one's point of view and perspective. It's not that sad from the Soviet point of view that they are conquering a part of the enemy state that invaded them several years before. But yes, this, I don't know. From a human point of view, it's unfortunate that all this was happening in the first place. Let's put it that way. So I think what's important for us to keep in mind here is that you have this attempt by the Soviets in October 1944 that we discussed in our previous episode that doesn't really get it done. So the Germans are able to keep control, even though they lose some territory, gain some of it back. They're able to keep control of East Prussia. This is a thorn in the Soviet side because if their goal is to get deeper into the heart of Germany and towards Berlin, this big political, symbolic prize. They want to get there before the Western Allies. They want to be able to have bragging rights to conquer the, as they call it, the lair of the fascist beast, the capital of Nazi Germany. If you're going to do that, you've got to cover your flanks. And the Soviets have this problem that if they don't resolve the situation in East Prussia and they send troops further south, farther to the west, that they're going to be exposed to German troops in the Courland pocket in today's Latvia, and also potentially German forces in East Prussia. So the Soviets do, in January 1945, launch an offensive across the Vistula River. And by the end of January, they're at the Oder River, which is only like 60 kilometers from Berlin. They stop there because then they need to kind of take a breath and reset everything for a big offensive against Berlin. But they need to fix this problem of the flanks. And now that flank is going to get longer and longer throughout January as those spearheads are advancing towards the Oder River in the heart of Germany. East Prussia is a big part of resolving that problem. So simultaneously, starting on the 12th of January, the Red Army launches an offensive to achieve what it could not in October of the previous year and to capture East Prussia. So the Soviets are obviously in a very advantageous position, right? They have, over the whole, let's say, Eastern Front, they have about 6 million men under arms, ready to go, fighting men, whereas the Germans have about 2 million, plus maybe 200,000, various and sundry Hungarians and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, right? So in the immediate area of East Prussia, there are about 1.7 million Soviets. They have about 3,000 tanks, and they have about 25,000 artillery pieces. Red Army's strength is always artillery, right? The Germans, to try to resist that, have about 600,000 men in the best case scenario, about 700 tanks, and about 8,000 artillery. So we're looking at give or take 3+1 advantage, which is the rule of thumb of the minimum of what you want if you're going to attack an enemy. So the Soviets do have that. And that's kind of where things are at on January 12th when the offensive kicks off. Now, I should also mention, okay, so the Germans have maybe 600,000 men, but as usual, that's just a number. What are the quality of those troops? What kind of equipment do they have? What kind of logistical support do they have? And all of this is in a bad state for the Germans at this stage. They have all sorts of conscripts who are older. They're using Volkssturm at this stage of the war. Volkssturm, since the fall of 1944, are mostly older men, but a small amount of teenagers as well, young teenagers, who've been called up as this last ditch kind of reserve to try to hold back the Soviets. So that's a component to this 600,000 men as well. And to be frank, they don't have a very high combat value, let's put it that way. So the Germans are in a bad way before the fighting even begins.
Absolutely. It's not looking good for the Germans, is it? And the Volkssturm is interesting because the Volkssturm is called up pretty much around the same time as the Soviets entered Germany for the first time in 1944. Again, you can see there's an interesting link there. And you already talked about the combat value of these very young or very old people, and of course, it's not really there. So that's just the way it is, unfortunately. But there we are, and a lot of them just get killed and die because most of them don't know how to behave tactically in a proper way on the battlefield. So there is that. So as you said, 600,000 looks good on paper. In reality, it is a bit of a different story. But the one thing that the Germans have as an advantage is the terrain, which, and we talked about this in the previous episode, which generally speaking favors the defender, because attacking forces are channeled by the terrain. You've got lakes, you've got the deep dark woods, you have marshy areas, you've got bogs. So it's quite predictable as to where the enemy will advance towards you. And of course, in these spots, the Germans then prepare defensive positions. So there are accounts from that particular period that say, well, all of East Prussia was just like a spider web of fortifications. I mean, that's probably looking at it a bit too positively. And if you say what actually is one of these fortifications, might just have been some sort of dugout, because like in most areas, when the enemies are closing in onto Germany, the Germans had left the preparation for all these things too late. They have the problem of the civilian population that they still need to evacuate. You can see there's all sorts of problems and issues coming together here on the German side. And then on the 12th/13th of January 1945, they are then hit, these 600,000, by these, roughly speaking, 1.5 to 1.7, as you said, million Soviet troops as they advance. And you're absolutely right. Well, the Soviets, even the Russians, have always made use of artillery. It is interesting when you look at how they employ this. We quite often think that, well, the Soviets were just stupid. They were doing the same thing again and again and again from 1941 to 1945. It's just a steamroller. You just throw manpower at the enemy, and lots of people get killed, and no one cares. Well, lots of people get killed. However, the Soviet and the Red Army is also a learning organization. And by 1945, the coordination, for example, between infantry and between artillery and also armor is getting better and better. There are inherent issues and problems. For example, the communication systems are very, very poor on the Soviet side, so they don't have enough radios, which makes it very difficult in a battle situation to really organize the troops on the ground. But they're trying to learn, they're trying to get better. And again, and that's why I'm mentioning this, you can see, I would argue, probably the steepest learning curve in the area of artillery. And of course, I would say that as a gunner, that you have to have a lot of learning going
No
on
bias.
in artillery, no bias at all. But it is interesting when you look at how they organize things, because at the beginning, it's in 1941, quite often, it looks a little bit like a rolling barrage, like the First World War. This is now very different in 1945, and it has become much more sophisticated. It's not as sophisticated as what the Germans were doing, or for that matter, particularly in the area of artillery, the Allies were doing. So the Germans had the utmost respect, in particular, for British artillery. They thought it was the best artillery of the war, better than their own. And you can see the Soviets never get to that stage, but there is a lot of learning. And what they don't learn, well, they basically they make do with sheer firepower, because they've got a lot of guns, and you mentioned the numbers. So these are the positions that are then being hit by the Soviets, the German positions on that day. Interesting enough, a little bit, you might say, a bit of a replay in the first couple of days of the October offensive that we looked at in the previous episode. So the Soviets are attacking, they're bringing in troops, they're trying to push through the German defensive lines and positions. However, they are suffering extremely heavy casualties. The Germans have positioned themselves in very, very good ways, very clever ways. They're using interlocking arcs of fire, all these things, and so they're fighting a very successful, I might say, defensive battle. So, on average, during the first day, the Red Army managed to fight its way into the German defensive line and position, but it can't achieve the breakthrough, and it can't exploit. So they basically make somewhere in the region, again, it depends on exactly where you are, but the penetration is roughly 1.5 kilometers deep. That is not enough to break through the German defensive line. So they only have broken through, the Germans have a number of defensive lines, so at that stage they've broken through the first three, but there are more to come. It takes them 5 days to really break through this German defense in depth, which in some areas can be up to 20 kilometers deep. So the Germans have really used the time wisely to prepare the defensive positions, to prepare this entire area for the battle that they knew would come. So they have used that time particularly wisely. But then in the end, the Soviets do manage to break through. And once they have broken through in typical Soviet style, they then push in the mechanized force, and they're trying to exploit. And this is what they do. And on the 24th of January, the Soviet force then reaches the Vistula Lagoon. And that means basically that the troops in East Prussia, the German troops, are now cut off from mainland Germany. So you now have yet another pocket in this area, because you've got the Courland pocket, now you've got this pocket. And everybody knows that these forces are now cut off. You either try to reestablish the land bridge, which you know is going to be very, very difficult against the overwhelming Soviet Red Army, or you now start to supply the troops by sea, because the Germans, to a large degree, are still in control of the Baltic Sea at that particular stage. I mean, we'll return to that later on. We look at Soviet U-boats or submarines and things like this. But on the whole, the Germans can still get material into the pocket and, for example, wounded and civilians out. So that is still possible. But if you're sitting there, you're now sitting somewhere in the Konigsberg area, whether you're civilian or you're military, you're beginning to think, this is not looking very good, is it? So you're now basically cut off, you're surrounded. And you know, with every day that goes on, the Soviets are getting stronger and you're getting weaker, whether it's in the pocket or outside the pocket. And the chances of reestablishing this land bridge are getting slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. So it's, again, just like at the beginning of this operation, it's not looking particularly good for the Germans and on the German side.
All right, folks, time for a quick break and an announcement of gratitude from me on behalf of Matthias and I, and also Linus and Dan from the Battle Guide team. We want to thank Benny. And why do I want to thank Benny? Because Benny from New Hampshire in the USA is our newest colonel level supporter. And it's people like Benny who allow us to do what we do here at the podcast. As you know, if you're a regular listener, if you're a new listener and you're thinking, hey, I like this podcast, I want it to be able to continue, I want to learn more about World War II and why it's important, and bore my wife or husband or partner with more World War II stories that I hear from the podcast, well, then you could consider supporting our podcast as well so that we can keep doing what we do. So thanks so much, Benny from New Hampshire, not far from my home region of Quebec. So we're kind of from the same neck of the woods if you stretch it a little bit. Very glad to have you with us. And yes, just thanks again for supporting what we do. Yeah, I mean, this time the Soviets are able to achieve their operational goal, and that is to be able to get through those defensive lines. The Germans, their lines were also a little bit compressed. They weren't as in depth as they probably would have liked. The secondary positions were a little closer to the front line positions, which of course makes them then more vulnerable once there's a penetration. I think it's worth bearing in mind, I probably should have mentioned this right off the top, that what the Soviets want to do is to create a pocket, right? So that doesn't happen by accident. They have two fronts, again, for the uninitiated. A Soviet front, capital F, is kind of like an army group for other European armies. They have two that are involved in this operation, the 3rd and 2nd Belarusian fronts. One of them is kind of pushing more or less west towards Königsberg, but the other one is south of East Prussia and pushing a bit more upwards towards the north. And the idea is we can protect the flank of our troops that are moving on this offensive towards Berlin in the distance. We can protect that flank, but then we can also cut off the troops in East Prussia because we know the Germans are not going to want to give up Königsberg without a fight. It's a historic German city. It would be a propaganda disaster if they gave it up in order to evacuate some troops. So the Soviets are able to do what they want to do. They break through, they create this pocket. The siege of Königsberg then begins from the later part of January. And the Soviets, it's not like they have super easy time of it, but they're able to impose their will on the enemy. And that, in military thinking, is what you want to do, right? You want to be able, nothing's going to go perfect. There's going to be, friction on the battlefield. Plans are not going to work out. You're going to lose people that you didn't expect to lose. You're going to be delayed here, delayed there. All of this happens to the Soviets, no question. But they are able to impose their will on the enemy, and they're able to cut off this pocket in East Prussia more or less by the end of January, pretty much, right? So I think if we were to take a step back, that's how, if I'm trying to imagine this operation in its early phases starting to play out, those are some of the things that I tend to think about to help me understand it a little bit more. So that brings us up to, okay, so we have a pocket, and then things are a little predictable from there on out. Let's put it that way.
Let's put it that way. I think you're absolutely right. Yes, absolutely. But of course, what is also in some ways predictable, I'd say when you have an army has got a problem, what's the first thing you do? Well, basically you redesignate things, you rename things. In the civilian world, you would form a committee because that's always useful. Whatever happens, always form a committee.
Rebranding.
So, and this is exactly what the Germans do. So on the 25th of January 1945, they renamed the army groups on the Eastern Front. Army Group North, the former one, which is now encircled in the Kurland pocket, so that's in the Baltic states, that becomes Army Group Kurland. And Army Group Center, which had been pushed into this area in late 1944, now becomes Army Group North. And so this is the army group that is now fighting in East Prussia, in particular in the area around Königsberg. Because as you said, the Soviets, they are in the driving seat. The Soviets can now dictate what they're going to do. They still know there's going to be heavy fighting. They still know there's going to be casualties, but they are acting and the Germans are reacting. So to use that military term, they got into the Germans' OODA loop, so the decision-making cycle. And of course, it's not only decision-making, it's also just the simple fact that the Germans don't have enough manpower, enough guns, enough petrol, enough of anything. So as a consequence of that, relatively quickly, the Soviets are able to break this one pocket that you really have, the East Prussia pocket, into three. And so that happens more or less basically by the end of January. And so you got these three pockets. The main one, you might say, that's around Königsberg, so the big city, where you have, well, people have said, again, it's always a bit with a pinch of salt, about 200,000 people still in the city, plus the military there. You then have the adjacent Samia Peninsula, where you have a small pocket, and then you have the one on the coast of the Vistula Lagoon, the Heiligenbeil pocket, as it's called. So these are the ones they're cut off. To begin with, Königsberg is not entirely cut off within this pocket, because you still have a very, very small land bridge going into other parts of the pocket. And that is relatively important, because it means, for example, to get it into Pillau, which is a harbor from which a lot of the ships were departing at that stage. So yes, Königsberg is surrounded, but it's still being supplied. So it's not 100% cut off. So as long as you still have, for example, Pillau and some other harbors, you might be able to just hang on. You know exactly if there's another big offensive, the state of affairs you're in at the moment, you're probably not going to survive. But for the time being, you can still continue the fight, and you can get the wounded out, you can get civilians out. Because what happens then is also that the fighting or the front line stabilizes for a while. You have some fighting, very heavy fighting in the area of Königsberg itself. It's all to do with this little land bridge. So the Soviets, they managed to cut it. The Germans launch a counterattack. And it's all to do through a place which was called Midgeten. So that was a very important logistical hub as well. It's basically on the road between Königsberg and Pillau, that is overrun on the 29th by the Soviets. And then you have these towing and throwing, these counterattacks. And in the end, the Germans are actually able to reopen this connection using a captured T-34 tank, which they send forward, and then they fight their way through. And then for quite some time, say about 2 months or so, this land bridge remains open. So Königsberg can still be supplied. So that makes it look, is better the right word? Less desperate, perhaps, for the fighters in Königsberg. But as I said, it's still not looking good for the Germans. And from the 19th of February, as I already said, well, this is when the Germans open this land bridge again. And then the front line stabilizes for quite some time. That lasts all the way into, well, basically by March, it's really stabilized. The Soviets have run out of steam. The Germans are exhausted anyway. And the Soviets are now gathering strength again for the final big attack in this area. And that, of course, is against the city of Königsberg itself. In the last episode, we talked a little bit about Königsberg. In the old days, a beautiful city. Nothing is left of Königsberg as it was. So, I mean, I've never been. I've just seen pictures, but it's a typical Soviet-style city. In modern day, I think the Soviets, or the Russians, we should say now, are trying to at least create some links back to the old German history. So I don't know, Jesse, have you ever been to Königsberg, or have you ever been there?
I have not yet anyway.
No, me neither. So, but apparently, I don't know if it's true. So if you've been there, if you've seen it, tell us whether it's true or correct us. Apparently, it's now a thing for the young Russians when you get married to go to the cathedral. They're now, again, cherishing Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher who was from Königsberg. So there's a little bit of some sort of idea of the old pre-Soviet history, but I don't think there's an awful lot. And why is that? Well, obviously, because the city was destroyed. The city is actually destroyed to about 80%, even before the Soviets get there. And that's through air raids. So in 1941, you have, or between 1941 and 1943, you have the Soviet Air Force dropping a handful of bombs on Königsberg, but that doesn't really matter, and so nothing really happens. But then in 1944, in the summer of 1944, in August, you have two big RAF air raids on Königsberg, and Königsberg isn't really defended. So the anti-air is relatively weak. Because looking at the map, people say, you know what, this is too far away, nothing's going to happen, so we better use the anti-aircraft guns somewhere else. So it's pretty much an undefended city. And also, the Germans looking at the map think it's too far away for the Allied bombers anyway. They will not be able to get here. But they do. And so in two nights in August 1945, they more or less flatten Königsberg. So that's even before the Soviets get there. And after the fighting, then in 1945, Königsberg is destroyed to about 90 to 95%. So not much left standing. It all causes a diplomatic incident as well, by the way, the Allied bombing or the British bombing, because when the Germans look at the map and say, well, the Brits will not even be able to get here because it's too far, of course, they're looking at national airspaces. But what the British actually do is that they fly through the Swedish airspace because that shortens the distance. And that, of course, is a violation of a neutral country, to which the Swedish government officially protests when they, the ambassador in London. But of course, let's face it, there is no consequence at all. Why would there be? And that is it. So that's the fate of Königsberg in a nutshell. So completely destroyed and completely gone. But I've now said, well, but the end of Königsberg, well, we need to talk about, well, let's call it the beginning of the end, perhaps, and that, of course, is the fighting itself in and around Königsberg. I have rambled for a long, long time. Jesse, over to you. I shut up now.
Well, just maybe to add a little bit of the picture away from Königsberg and East Prussia. You mentioned that the front kind of calms down for a little while, and there's a sort of calm before the storm after the initial Soviet gains. The Germans are trapped in these three more or less pockets that you mentioned. Well, there are a few reasons why the Soviets slow down in this area. One of them is because they want to send some forces to attack in another German region called Pomerania. So, as I mentioned, they're also pushing forces towards Berlin, a little bit further south. Okay, they've kind of contained East Prussia, but now the region of Pomerania is the one where the Germans could potentially threaten the flanks of a Soviet advance on Berlin. So they want to take out Pomerania. So they have a few other priorities. I mean, the Soviets have a lot of irons in the fire along the whole front. There's another factor that's even higher on the kind of strategic political scale, and that is at the beginning of February, there's this big inter-allied meeting in Yalta in the Crimea. And they're figuring out, well, how are we going to split up the European pie between the democratic capitalist powers and the Soviets? And so, of course, Stalin is of the opinion that possession is 9/10 of the law. And so he's looking to already sort of have his military operations complement his longer-term post-war political goals, right? This kind of makes sense. I don't know how many times I've said it on the podcast, but war is politics by other means, usually. And so Stalin is interested in advancing Soviet post-war influence also in other parts of Central Europe, not just into the heart of Germany and towards Berlin. He's interested in places like Budapest, places like Vienna, for example. So the Soviet focus also kind of shifts a little bit down to that area where there are some operations that we are not going to cover in detail in this episode. And that's a part of these discussions at Yalta. So that's related to the discussions at Yalta, that the Soviets are trying to push their control as far as they can, get control of the Danube Basin, all that sort of stuff. So the situation in East Prussia gets impacted not only by operational considerations close by in Pomerania, but also by the global kind of Europe-wide political and strategic outlook, which I think is interesting, which I think lends is an interesting connection between the local and the global and political, let's say. Of course, during all of this, there are also lots of German civilians who are fleeing their homes, who are trying to evacuate. We will cover that in a bit more detail in a subsequent episode. We'll stick more to the military and political side for today. But just so you know, listeners and viewers out there, yes, the civilian refugees are a big part of all these operations that we're talking about, and they will get their due attention in their own episode. But of course, the Soviets don't wait around forever, even though they have these other considerations. And they start to put pressure on these little pockets. And of course, if the Soviets start putting pressure in these circumstances, the Germans are not going to be in a position to successfully withstand that pressure forever. So from the middle of March till the end of March, basically the German pocket at Heiligenbeil that we mentioned is destroyed by the Soviets. They wipe out that pocket entirely. And then at the beginning of April, they turn their attention to Königsberg and they try to resolve the siege there.
And Konigsberg, of course, is the price, isn't it? That's the price of the East Prussia campaign. So this is really what you want to defend if you're German, or seize if you're Soviet. And the Soviets managed to, again, mass troops, in particular, again, artillery. We talked about the importance of artillery. So statistically, you're now looking at around 250 guns per kilometer in this area. So that's a lot of firepower that you get on the Soviet side.
That's bad.
That is bad.
From the German point of view.
The advantage for the Germans is, however, that Königsberg is a very heavily fortressed city. So it is, even before the war, it's of course close to the Russian Empire. It was always kind of exposed a little bit. It's a very important place. It was a very, very strong garrison town. And after the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians built basically 3 defensive belts around them. These were very, very heavily fortified positions. They have a lot of fortresses there as well. Now, you might argue, are they still good enough to withhold strong artillery fire in 1945? Perhaps not the super guns, but the average Soviet gun is a normal field gun of relatively small calibers. And the German defensive positions would still be able to withhold bombardments from these. So that's, you might say, that's the trade-off perhaps between these two sides. And in order to defend Königsberg, well, the Germans have in total, and if you look at my notes, they have 5 divisions. The 61st Division, the 69th Division, 367th Division, and the 458th and 461st Volksgrenadier Divisions. The Volksgrenadier Divisions are interesting. So they are created in the very late stage of the war, so around this time here. And the idea behind them is, in theory, to make them even stronger and better than a normal division. So the numbers are much, much smaller, sometimes about half of what a normal infantry division would have had at the outbreak of the war, but you give them more weapons. So the higher number of machine guns, machine pistols, all these things. So you basically trade in manpower for firepower. That is the idea. In reality, it doesn't really work because industry can't provide all these things. So you end up with weaker divisions numerically and less equipment. So they actually, most of them are not particularly good, even though this had been the idea to begin with. So again, you can see there are some issues. Of course, these troops are already exhausted. They're already tired. And they're now hit by a 4-day artillery bombardment that the Soviets unleash onto the German positions. And after these 4 days, on the 6th of April, 1945, the Soviets then launched the attack. And they call it a star attack because they're advancing onto the force of Königsberg from all directions, basically trying to really squeeze the German positions in one go. So not giving the Germans the chance, the ability to move troops from one area to the other, what's known as operating on the inner lines, but basically just squeezing the German troops all at once. The Soviets do run into problems. There are a number of fortresses that the Germans, to begin with, can hold because they are well built, they are well established. The artillery fire couldn't breach them. There is some talk of German anti-fascists getting involved, trying to infiltrate the German lines as fifth columns. So that gets that. I think even when you look at Wikipedia, I think Wikipedia makes a lot of this. So I wouldn't buy too much into this because even if that happened, I mean, They keep fighting, don't they? They keep fighting. So it's just one of these. I think also the German journal, he's called Lasch. He writes a book about Königsberg. It's called Endkampf vor Ende in Königsberg, I think it's called. And he mentions these anti-fascists as well. So again, I wouldn't give too much to that.
No, me neither. I've come across mentions of German communists coming out of the woodwork in Berlin and shooting on German troops from behind. That's mostly in SS guys' memoirs. And
exactly.
I've never seen any other serious, evidence for that. So I think that's probably a bit of a legend.
I think so. I think absolutely. What you have then, say that the attack slows down because the Germans are able to hold them. They launch again a number of counterattacks with the last remaining reserves that they have. So just imagine this scenario now, sitting in this bombed out, burning city, which had been a shell only, or before the fighting starts. You have these defensive lines, you're sitting in your bunker, and once they've seized these positions, that's going to be the end of it. There is no support forthcoming. So again, raise this interesting question that we've, I think, looked at a number of times in the course of this podcast, as well as to why do these guys keep fighting? Why do you not surrender? Because there is no way out. And that probably is, again, for another podcast. And on the 7th, the situation changes slightly because the weather improves. And that makes it possible for the Soviets to have more air support. And again, you can see even more ordnance dropped onto the Germans. There's still a number of these strong points that hold out. For example, in the north, there is one of these forts. It's called a Fort 4-5, so because they're numbered. That is one of the very, very strong defensive positions that the Germans use. The Soviets finally, they basically managed to put lots of explosive at the base, blow the whole thing up, then they get in, and so they breach this defensive belt, you might say, as well. And then the next morning, the German troops in the area there surrender. At this stage, on the 7th, so the German commander Otto Lasch, he's called, he realized, that fight is lost. We're not going to win this. And he actually sends a message to Hitler back to Berlin and says, well, ask for the permission to surrender, which of course is refused because, well, Hitler says, well, that's not going to happen. So you fight to the last soldier, not to the last cartridge. That's different because once you fight, you're allowed to surrender. To the last soldier, that means until you're all dead. And in you might say typical German fashion of 1945, of course, Lasch obeys the order and they continue to fight. The story then, basically the stories repeat themselves. And on the 8th, there is more fight. You can see how the Germans are getting more squeezed and more squeezed. And on the 9th of April, it's now so obvious that the Soviets are going to win this very quickly because they have breached this defensive belt. They're now fighting inside the city. And at around 1800 hours, there's a Soviet guy with a white flag who arrives, and basically Lasch, he then surrenders to the Soviets, who are now only a few hundred meters away from his command post in the bunker in the center of town. So that he sees there's no point in fighting anymore. Let's surrender. When Hitler hears about this, of course, he's outraged. He orders him to death by hanging in absentia. That, of course, doesn't really bother him. But what is not so nice is that his entire family, who are in Denmark at the time, they're also arrested, only then liberated, freed after the collapse of the Nazi state. Lasch himself, you might say, is a very, very unlucky man because obviously he goes into Soviet captivity. And he remains in Soviet captivity all the way to 1955. So he is one of these very, very few of the last ones that returned back home in 1955. So he basically spends 10 years in a prison of war camp, comes back, then moves to West Germany and dies, I think, in the early 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. Having written this book about the fight and fall of Königsberg. And that basically brings this operation in Konigsberg itself to an end. You still have one of these 3 pockets that is still existent that also gets then eliminated quite quickly by the Soviets, because everybody also knows, you can see, once Königsberg itself has fallen, the fight in this pocket, in this area, is basically over. And that is the end, you might say, of Königsberg as a city, because it's completely destroyed, and also as a German city, because now, for all the political reasons that you mentioned and the evacuations that have happened, more of them happen now, and we'll talk about this at a later stage. This is basically the end of the German population in and of Königsberg. And the map, as you already explained earlier, has now drastically shifted and changed for good.
Yeah, probably culturally and politically a more significant military operation than militarily, right, in terms of its importance, consequences, and all of that. I do think I know we're going to talk about civilians in a future episode, but I do want to say a word about them during the siege or during the storming of Königsberg in the beginning of April, because I think that's an important part of the battle. Yeah, as far as Lasch is concerned, as you were talking about his, communications with Berlin and then his decision to not surrender, but then surrender, I have to admit, the thought ran through my mind. In typical German fashion, to the last soldier is interpreted as to the last soldier until a few hundred meters before my command post. And then I'll surrender. So, yeah, I have to admit I'm not filled with empathy for Lasch in those moments. Let's put it that way. But as far as the civilians go, right before the surrender, there's a particularly sort of tragic event, right? There's a back and forth amongst the authorities. Should the civilians go? Is that a priority? Do we put any resources for troops kind of helping civilians to evacuate? Usually the army and the civilian Nazi authorities, they don't really provide a lot in the way of planning and evacuation for German civilians. Königsberg is no different, although there are quite a lot who do get evacuated at different points. One of the final attempts to escape the center of the city occurs in the night of April 8th to 9th. And so the party officials, they say, okay, everybody should try to flee the center of the city, which they try to do to get to Samland, which is this final nearby area that's still holding out. Then the general kind of says, well, no, we probably shouldn't do that. In any case, some civilians do try. A big crowd of civilians do try to escape. It's at night. The Soviets detect a bunch of movement. I mean, of course, I guess it's debatable how they would have behaved if they had been sure that it was civilians. In any case, they just detect some movement. And so they open fire with all of this artillery that they have, Katyusha rockets, artillery mortars, and it's kind of a massacre, right? In the middle of the night, in the pitch black, all these confused mass of civilians surging out of the city and being cut down by all these explosions in the dark. It paints quite a horrific picture of the end of this operation and the storming of Königsberg. And of course, some of the responsibility for that situation has to go to the German authorities who didn't bother to organize proper evacuation for the civilians. Something like 30,000 German troops end up surrendering in the city. I do have a quote as well from Lasch. So folks, put your critical historical thinking caps on to put this in its context. This is General Lasch writing years afterwards his book about the battle. Anyway, this is what he had to say about the end of Königsberg. The houses burned and smoked. The Russians were adding to the stuffed furniture, musical instruments, kitchen utensils, paintings, and china, which they had already thrown from the windows. Shot-up cars stood between blazing tanks, and items of clothing and equipment were strewn about. Drunken Russians staggered around. They fired in wild abandon or tried to ride bicycles, and then fell off and lay bleeding and unconscious in the gutters. Weeping and struggling girls and women were dragged into the houses, and children called after their parents. The sights were intolerable. So, I am fairly certain from the works of other historians who've written about the fall of Königsberg that many of the examples he gives happened. Looting, rape, drunkenness, ill discipline in terms of firing off weapons. These were commonplace things in most cities, German cities, that the Red Army captures. Whether Lasch saw all of these scenes with his own eyes all at once in the way that he describes here is much harder to confirm, since he marched off into captivity when the Russians take control, when the Soviets take control of the city. So I leave you to judge critically the little account we had there by Lasch after the fact. So with that little quote from General Lasch, I think we'll close off the episode for today. We had a look at the context of the second and final Soviet operation to capture East Prussia in 1945, then the storming of Königsberg. And I think we should keep in mind as well the bigger picture where military operations on the ground get influenced by other priorities, including political and strategic priorities. It's one of the reasons why this operation took as long as it did, from January all the way up to the end of April 1945. So that's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed it and any of the other episodes that you've watched or listened to, it would be great if you considered becoming a supporter of our podcast. And you can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. If you become a supporter, you can make sure that we keep being able to do what we do. Plus, you can get access to some exclusive content in our war room. You can try all of this out for free, for a free trial, if you use the code Deep Dark Woods. Particular emphasis on East Prussian Deep Dark Woods for today. So, of course, we'd be very happy to see you in our supporter community. And otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Critically, the little account we had there by Lasch after the fact. That's it?
I think I've got anything else.
Okay, in that case, Linus is going to erase everything after I said the word Lasch.
Yeah.
And I will now draw the operation to a close.